The morning Florence Chandler loaded her late husband's rifle and walked out onto her porch to face down 4 armed men who wanted her land. She realized she had stopped being afraid somewhere between the second drought and the flood that took her barn, and that fearlessness was both her greatest gift and her loneliest possession. That was in the spring of 1882 in the Nebraska Sandhills, where the wind came off the high plains with a sound like something grieving, and the grass went on so long in every direction that a person could feel the world was nothing but sky and silence and the particular cruelty of distance. Florence had come to this land 7 years earlier as a young bride of 22, full of Walter Chandler's promises and her own considerable courage, and she had stayed on it after Walter died of a fever in the winter of 1878. Stayed because the land was hers now in the only way anything had ever truly been hers, through suffering and stubbornness and the refusal to let go. She was 29 now, which felt ancient some mornings and surprisingly young on others. She had dark auburn hair she kept braided back from her face because there was no time for vanity on a working homestead, and brown eyes that people sometimes described as warm until they saw what happened to those eyes when someone threatened what was hers. Her hands were calloused and capable. Her back was strong. She could read weather in the color of clouds and read intention in the posture of a man getting off a horse, and both those skills had kept her alive out here, where there was no one to call on and no one coming. The 4 men who had ridden up to her gate that spring morning were employed by a cattle baron named Harlan Greer, who operated out of a sprawling ranch 15 miles east, and who had been trying to push out the small homesteaders in the Sandhills for the better part of 3 years. He wanted their water rights. He wanted their grass. He mostly wanted them gone because small farms were an inconvenience to men who thought in terms of thousands of acres and thousands of head of cattle, and a particular vision of the West that left no room for a widow woman with 160 acres, and a deed she had filed herself at the county seat in broken boots because she could not afford new ones. Florence had met Harlan Greer exactly twice. The first time he had been polite in the oily way of men who underestimate women. The second time he had been less polite, and she had asked him to get off her land and then waited with the rifle visible across her arms until he did. She suspected this third communication, delivered through 4 hired men with hard eyes, was his way of escalating the conversation. She stood on the porch and kept the rifle easy in her hands, not aimed, just present. The way a reminder is present. The man in front, who had a jaw like a fence post and eyes set too close together, called out across the yard, "Mrs. Chandler, Mr. Greer would like to make you another offer on this property. He's prepared to be very generous." "He was generous last time," Florence said. "I declined." "Ma'am, I think you ought to reconsider. This is hard country for a woman alone." "I've noticed," she said pleasantly. "You can tell Mr. Greer the answer is still no, and the next time he sends men to my gate, I'll have them escorted off by the sheriff. Good morning, gentlemen." She held their gaze until they left. Then she went back inside and sat down at her kitchen table and let her hands shake for exactly 2 minutes before she made herself get up and go feed the chickens, because the chickens needed feeding regardless of what Harlan Greer wanted. That evening, she wrote a letter to the county sheriff, a man named Elias Boone, who was friendly enough but overworked and not inclined to make enemies of men like Harlan Greer without good reason. She wrote the letter carefully and kept it factual and mailed it the next day when she drove the wagon into the small town of Caldwell Crossing for supplies. Caldwell Crossing was the kind of town that existed because the land around it existed: a general store, a livery stable, a small church, a saloon that doubled as a gathering place for information and grievance, a post office built into the front room of the postmaster's house, and a population of 200 souls who were mostly connected to farming or ranching, and who had very specific opinions about both. Florence was known here. She was respected in the reserved way that frontier communities respected a woman who did not ask for help she hadn't earned, which meant she was respected at a distance that she sometimes found exhausting. She tied her horse at the post and went into the general store, where Emmett Frawley behind the counter greeted her with the particular warmth of a man who genuinely liked her and also wanted her to continue buying things on credit. "Morning, Florence. Got that flour you ordered." "Morning, Emmett. And the salt pork. Coming in on Thursday's wagon. You need anything else?" She moved through the store collecting what she needed, and she was standing at the counter working through her list when the door opened behind her, and a man came in. She heard the particular sound of boots on the wooden floor and the jingle of spurs, and did not look up because she had learned that looking up at every stranger in a frontier town was a habit that mostly just rewarded you with a crick in your neck. "Emmett," said the man, "you the one to ask about land hereabouts? I was told you know this area." "Depends on what you need to know," Emmett said, with the careful tone of a man who has learned caution about what information he gives to strangers. "I'm looking for work, anything going. I've got experience with cattle, horses, fencing, general ranch work. I heard there are homesteaders out here who might need an extra hand." Florence looked up then, not because she was particularly interested, but because she heard something in the voice that made her curious, a directness, a plainness, the absence of performance. The man was standing with his hat off, which was polite, holding it in both hands. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been lived in considerably, weathered and honest, the kind of face that had spent years in wind and sun, and had stopped trying to look like anything other than what it was. He was lean and broad-shouldered, and had the particular posture of someone who had worked hard enough for long enough that it had become the shape of him. His eyes, when they found hers as Emmett gestured slightly in her direction, were a clear, steady gray-blue that she associated with winter sky just before it cleared. "Mrs. Chandler might be the person to talk to," Emmett was saying. "She's got the Chandler homestead out on the western section. Good operation. She's been managing it herself since she lost her husband." The man looked at her with a kind of careful attention that was not rude and not presumptuous. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for Emmett making your business public before you'd agreed to it. I'm Tobias Redmond. I came up from Texas, worked a ranch down near Abilene for 4 years before the owner sold out, and I found myself looking for the next thing." "Florence Chandler," she said. She studied him the way she studied weather, looking for signs of what was actually coming. "What do you know about homestead farming? Ranching and farming aren't the same." "No, they're not," he agreed, which was the right answer. A man who tried to tell her they were the same would have lost her interest immediately. "I grew up on a small farm in Missouri before I went west. I know crops and I know cattle both. I'm not going to pretend I know this specific land, but I learn fast and I work hard and I don't need much." "What do you need?" "Board and meals and a fair wage. I've got my own horse and my own gear. I'm not looking to be carried." She looked at him for another moment. She had learned to make decisions about people quickly out here, because the luxury of extended deliberation was something the frontier rarely afforded. He had straight eyes and an easy way of standing still. He was not trying to impress her or manage her. He had taken his hat off. "I'll think on it," she said. "Come out to the property tomorrow morning if you're interested. I'll have made up my mind by then." She paid Emmett for her supplies, loaded the wagon, and drove home with the spring wind in her face and the prairie opening wide all around her. And she thought about the gray-blue eyes and the plain way he had spoken, and told herself firmly that what she needed was a capable ranch hand, and that was the only thing she needed to decide. She had been telling herself firm things for 4 years. Tobias Redmond rode out the next morning on a good-looking roan horse that he kept in good condition, which she noticed and appreciated. He arrived at 7 o'clock, which was the appropriate time, not too early to seem eager, not late enough to seem careless. She showed him the operation in full, because she believed that a person applying for work deserved to know exactly what they were getting into. She had 160 acres, of which about 60 were currently under cultivation with winter wheat that was coming in reasonably well. She had 30 head of cattle, a small mixed herd she'd built carefully over 4 years, and she had chickens and a kitchen garden and 2 pigs and a smokehouse, and a root cellar she dug herself after the barn floods had ruined a winter's worth of provisions. The barn had been rebuilt smaller but sturdier. The house was sound. She showed him the windmill she'd repaired 3 times with materials she'd fashioned herself when she couldn't afford to send away for proper parts. She showed him the fence line that ran along the northern boundary, which had been cut twice in the past year by persons unknown, though she had her suspicions about who those persons worked for. She showed him the well and the pasture and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property, which was the reason Harlan Greer wanted this land. Water rights in a dry country were worth more than gold and considerably more than the comfort or welfare of a widow woman. She told him about Greer. She told him plainly because he needed to know, and because she would not bring a man onto her land under false pretenses. When she finished, she said, "So that's the situation. It's not simple work and it's not without risk, and if that changes your interest, I'll understand it." Tobias had listened to all of it without interrupting, which she appreciated. Now he stood in the morning light looking out over the winter wheat field with an expression she couldn't quite read, though it didn't look like reluctance. "The fence cutting," he said. "You reported it to the sheriff. He wrote back that without witnesses he couldn't act. And you've been managing this alone since your husband passed." "I have." He turned and looked at her directly. "Mrs. Chandler, I'll take the job. The Greer situation is a problem, but it's a manageable one if we're careful about it." And the rest of it, he looked back over the land, and there was something in his expression that she recognized because she felt it herself, a kind of genuine regard for the landscape, for the stubborn effort it represented, for the wheat standing green and determined in the warming spring air. "The rest of it is good work, important work. I'd be proud to be part of it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Your room will be the tack room in the barn. I can put a proper cot in there and there's a wood stove. You'll eat in the kitchen with me unless you prefer otherwise." "Kitchen is fine," he said. "Good. We start with the northern fence line. It needs restretching before the cattle drift." He put his hat on. "Lead the way." She did. The first week they worked side by side and mostly in silence, which suited them both. Florence had not had a working partner since Walter, and the rhythm of sharing labor with another person took some adjusting. But Tobias turned out to be the kind of man who understood work in the way she understood it, as something you did with your whole self, attentively, without complaint. He did not try to do things for her that she was clearly capable of doing herself. He did not offer unnecessary advice. When he had a better method for something, he mentioned it once briefly, and then did it her way if she preferred, which she sometimes did and sometimes did not. He was good with the cattle. She could see that immediately, the quiet way he moved around them, the patience, the economy of motion that kept the animals calm. He could read a fence line almost as well as she could, which was saying something since she had spent 4 years learning this particular land's particular willingness to undermine a fence post. He worked from first light until the light was gone, and he didn't ask for recognition of it. She found herself, by the end of that first week, watching him sometimes when she didn't need to watch him, just noticing the way he talked to his horse, the way he looked at the sky in the evening with a kind of comfortable attentiveness, as if he and the weather had reached a long-standing agreement about who was in charge. The way he ate supper quickly and then sat at the kitchen table, and sometimes pulled a small worn book from his vest pocket and read for a while before saying good night and going to the barn. She did not let herself think too carefully about what she was noticing or why. The trouble came in June, as trouble in Nebraska often does, quickly and from multiple directions. First, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary began to drop. By the middle of June, it was 1/3 of its normal depth, and the grass on the east pasture was already going yellow at the tips. Florence had seen drought before, had survived 2 of them since Walter died, and she knew what the yellow tips meant. She began rationing the cattle's access to the creek immediately, rotating them through the pastures to preserve the grass, moving the most vulnerable animals to the area nearest the windmill where she could pump water for them. Tobias worked alongside her through the heat with no complaint and considerable inventiveness. He suggested digging a small storage pond a quarter-mile north of the house, using the low ground that collected runoff, which they did over the course of 2 brutal July days with pickaxes and shovels, until Florence's shoulders ached in a way she refused to admit, and her back spoke to her in the language of a much older woman. They lined the bottom of the pond with clay from the creek bed and diverted a small channel from the windmill pipe to fill it slowly. It was not a large pond, but it was water, and water in a drought was the difference between keeping your cattle and watching them die. "You've done this before," she said one evening while they sat on the porch after supper, too tired to do much more than breathe. "Dug a pond, improvised your way through a crisis. You knew exactly what to do." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening prairie. "My mother kept her farm after my father died. I was 12 when he went. There were 5 of us kids and 100 acres of Missouri clay and not much else. She improvised through every crisis I can remember." He paused. "She was a tough woman. Was. She passed 3 years ago, the winter of '79. "I'm sorry," Florence said, and she meant it in the particular way of people who have also lost people and know that the word is both inadequate and necessary. "She would have liked this place," he said. "She would have liked you." Florence looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the horizon, not at her, and there was a simple honesty in the way he'd said it that made her chest feel strange and tight in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She said, "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," and went inside to wash the supper dishes. The drought lasted through August. Florence lost 4 cattle, 2 to the heat and 2 to a waterborne sickness that Tobias helped her identify quickly enough to isolate the remaining animals before it spread. She saved 26. When the rains finally came in early September, tentative at first and then generous, she stood in her yard in the rain with her face turned up to the sky and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since June. Tobias stood a few feet away and did the same thing. When she looked over at him, his face was turned up and he was smiling, and she thought it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him look. Then he looked at her, and they were both standing in the September rain with wet hair and ridiculous expressions, and she started to laugh, actually laugh, which surprised her, because she hadn't laughed like that in longer than she could clearly remember. And then he was laughing too, and the rain came down harder, and she thought that this was a moment she would keep. They didn't speak about it afterward, but something had shifted, the way the light shifts after a rain, same landscape, new quality of illumination. October brought an unexpected crisis. Florence drove into Caldwell Crossing for supplies and came back to find that someone had cut the lock on her smokehouse and taken most of the cured meat she'd put up. Not Greer's men, this was different, the work of opportunistic theft rather than organized pressure. But it was a serious blow to her winter provisions, and she stood in the empty smokehouse with the cold October air coming through the door and felt something dangerous happening in her stomach that was not quite despair but was in the neighborhood. Tobias found her there. He looked at the empty hooks and the broken lock and at her face, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We still have the cattle. We can slaughter 2 before winter. And I know a way to smoke brisket that'll keep well in the root cellar, my mother's method. It takes longer, but the result is better. And we can put in an order at Emmett's for salt pork, not as good as what you had, but it'll get us through." She nodded. She was looking at the empty hooks. "Florence," his voice was careful, "you still have the cattle and the wheat and the root cellar and the chickens and this place. Someone took meat from you. That's a real loss, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't, but it's recoverable." She looked at him. No one had spoken her first name quite like that before, without ceremony, without the slight awkwardness that usually came with it, as if it were simply what she was called and he was simply using it. "I know it's recoverable," she said. "I'm angry, not defeated." Something in his expression settled into what might have been relief and what might have been pure admiration. "Good," he said. Then let's go take the inventory of what's left and figure out the winter plan. She locked the broken smokehouse with a different lock and rolled up her sleeves and did exactly that. November arrived with the first frost and a letter from the county sheriff that did not say much and promised little, and a second letter from a lawyer in the county seat, one Harlan Greer had apparently retained, suggesting again that Mrs. Chandler might wish to consider her options regarding the sale of her property. Florence wrote back to the lawyer in the direct, precise language she had learned from years of dealing with men who assumed she could be confused or intimidated by official stationery, and she filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office in addition to the sheriff. She showed both letters to Tobias at supper. He read them carefully and handed them back. "He's increasing pressure," Tobias said. "He always does before winter. He wants people to settle before spring planting because in spring they have hope again and hope makes people stubborn. You seem pretty stubborn regardless of season." She looked up and found him looking at her with that quiet expression she had come to recognize, warm and measured at the same time, like something carefully tended. "I have to be," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not criticizing it. I think it's—" He stopped and looked down at his coffee cup. "I think it's one of the finest things about you." She felt the color come into her face and was grateful for the low lamplight. She said, "I think we ought to talk about the spring fencing plan," and he let her redirect the conversation without comment, which was another thing she had come to appreciate about him, the way he never pushed past what she was willing to offer. Winter settled in with serious intent in December. The Sandhills in winter were a particular kind of severity. The wind off the open plains drove the cold into everything, and the snow came horizontally, and the distances that were merely lonely in summer became genuinely dangerous. Florence had survived 4 Nebraska winters alone, which had required a system. She kept a rope strung from the house to the barn so she could navigate it in whiteout conditions. She kept 3 weeks of provisions in the house always, and she slept with the wood stove banked high enough that she woke up only slightly cold at 2 in the morning to add wood. Having Tobias there changed the winter considerably. The work of keeping the animals alive in deep cold required 2 people working efficiently, checking on them twice a day, breaking ice on the water troughs, hauling feed from the barn, monitoring the cattle for signs of cold stress. They developed a routine so practiced it became almost wordless. She went right, he went left, and they met in the middle and compared notes and went back to the house for coffee and sometimes, on the worst days, for a shared silence that was not uncomfortable at all. She noticed that he had begun doing small things. He always had the coffee ready when she came in from her morning rounds. He had repaired the hinge on the kitchen door she'd been meaning to get to for 2 months. He had carved a small holder for her wool cards that hung from a nail near the fireplace, useful and neat, and thoughtful enough that she had stood looking at it for a full minute before she trusted herself to say thank you. He had done it while she was sleeping, she thought, and had not mentioned it, and the quiet deliberateness of that small kindness had done something uncomfortable and wonderful to her composure. She was not unaware of herself in this. She was a practical woman and an honest one, and she had learned the hard way that dishonesty with yourself was a luxury the frontier didn't permit. She knew what she was feeling. She had been feeling it since October, maybe since September, maybe since the moment he had taken his hat off in Emmett's store and looked at her with those steady gray-blue eyes and not tried to impress her with anything at all. But there were complications. He was her employee. She was his employer. There was the matter of her independence, which she had built with such specific pain and would not casually surrender to any circumstance. There was the matter of not knowing his intentions. There was the matter of the possibility that she was reading warmth into behavior that was simply professional decency. She turned these complications over in her mind on the long dark evenings while she sewed or knitted or read by lamplight while he read across the table from her, his worn book open in the yellow light, and tried to be sensible. January brought the worst of it. A blizzard came in off the north on a Tuesday night with no more warning than a quick shift in the wind and a sudden thickening of the sky. And by midnight the world outside the windows was a solid white nothing, and the temperature had dropped far below what was safe for the cattle. They went out together in the worst of it, navigating by the rope, moving the cattle from the open pasture into the barn in a process that required 2.5 hours in conditions that hurt your lungs to breathe and your face to feel. Florence lost sensation in her fingers twice and got it back by pressing her hands against the warm flank of a frightened cow, and she could see Tobias working next to her with his head down against the wind and snow building on the brim of his hat. And she had the sudden vivid thought that she did not know what she would do if something happened to him. The thought alarmed her sufficiently that she filed it away to deal with later and focused on getting the last of the cattle into the barn. When they finally came back into the house and the door shut against the storm and the warmth of the wood stove rushed at them, they were both so cold they stood for a long time close to the stove without speaking, thawing their hands and their faces. After a while Tobias said, "All of them made it in." "Yes," she said. "You didn't hesitate once out there," he said. "Not once." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was unlike any expression she had seen on him before, open, in a way that made her understand he had stopped managing what showed on his face. "I was afraid the whole time," she said, "because it was true." "That's exactly what I meant," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she said she was going to make soup, and he said that was a good idea, and they moved around her small kitchen together, him slicing bread while she put the pot on, close enough that their movements overlapped sometimes, and neither of them moved further away to prevent it. February came, and so did more trouble. 3 of Florence's fence posts along the northern line were found knocked down, and the cattle had drifted during the night, and 2 of them had got onto Harlan Greer's adjoining land, or rather, onto the land of one of the smaller ranchers whose cattle Greer was now running on shares, which was Greer's way of expanding his footprint without buying the land outright. The rancher's foreman came over and was unpleasant about it. Florence was unpleasant back, with great precision. Tobias stood at her shoulder and said nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing because the foreman kept looking at him, sideways the way men who want to fight look at obstacles to the fight they want. And Tobias's absolute stillness was more discouraging than anything he could have said. They got the cattle back and rebuilt the fence posts that afternoon, and that evening Florence walked the full northern line in the cold and found a boot print in the snow near the downed posts that did not belong to her or Tobias or anyone else who had any business on her land. She photographed it in her mind the way she had learned to photograph things she might need to remember later. Then she went home and wrote in the journal she kept of every incident, every threat, every piece of evidence of harassment, because she had learned that a woman alone was not believed on testimony alone, but that a careful written record was a different kind of argument. "You've been keeping this the whole time?" Tobias asked when she showed him the journal. "Since the first time Greer sent men to my gate," she said. 2 years of records." He turned the pages carefully, reading. "Florence," he said, and then stopped. "What? This is going to matter," he said. "When the time comes, this record is going to matter a great deal." She nodded. "I hope so. I wrote it so it would." He set the journal down and looked at her, and she could see him working at something, deciding something, and then he said, "I'd like to write a letter. I know a man in Lincoln. I met him 3 years ago when I was passing through. He's a lawyer with the Territorial Land Rights Office. If I write to him and send copies of some of these entries, it might carry more weight coming from a legal direction." She studied him. "You never mentioned you knew someone in the land office." "I didn't know it would be relevant until I saw this journal. I don't want to overstep. Writing a letter on my behalf is overstepping." "Then I won't," he said immediately. She was quiet for a moment. "Write the letter," she said. "Show it to me before you send it." He nodded. The letter went out in the next post wagon, and she read it before it went and thought that he wrote well, plainly and specifically, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he did. A response came 6 weeks later in April, which was not coincidentally when the spring began to change things. April in the Nebraska Sandhills is a negotiation between winter and summer, in which both sides are still convinced they can win, and the landscape shifts daily between mud and frost and the sudden wild green of new grass, and then back to gray. It smells in April of cold earth warming and wet grass, and the particular sweetness of the wind when it stops being purely hostile and begins to carry hints of what's coming. Florence loved April even when it was difficult, which it usually was. The letter from Tobias's contact in the land office said that Mrs. Chandler's complaint and the accompanying documentation had been received and would be reviewed, and that there were several complaints from other homesteaders in the same county regarding the same party, which meant there was now a pattern on record. This was not a victory, but it was a foothold, and Florence had learned to value footholds. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table while Tobias stood by the window looking out at the spring morning, and then she set it down and felt something loosen in her chest that had been braced tight for a long time. "This is because of you," she said. He turned from the window. "It's because of your record-keeping, and your contact and your letter. We did it together," he said simply. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the April light came in gold through the kitchen window, and she thought that she was done being careful, that she had been careful long enough and to enough effect, and that there was a kind of courage she had not yet tried, and it was time. She said, "Tobias, yes, I think you should know that." She stopped and reorganized what she was trying to say because it mattered that she say it correctly. "I think you should know that you have become essential to me, not just to the operation of this place, though you have, but to me." She held his gaze steadily because she would not look away from this any more than she looked away from Greer's men. "I don't say that to put you in a position. I say it because I've spent 4 years alone, and in that time I've come to believe that honesty about what you feel is more useful than protecting yourself from it." Tobias was very still. Then he moved away from the window and came to the table and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, so they were looking at each other across the small kitchen table the way they sat every evening, except that nothing about this moment was ordinary. "Florence," he said, "can I tell you something I've been not saying for about 6 months, please? I came to this county looking for work. That was true, but I'd heard about this homestead, not from Emmett before I came into town. I'd stopped at a farmstead about 12 miles east the night before, and the farmer there, a man named Cutter, talked about the widow in the western section who had kept her place through everything Greer could throw at it. He described what you'd done out here, the drought, the floods before I came, the fence cutting, the men at the gate, and he said she was the toughest thing on the frontier and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to pay. And I thought that was the kind of place I wanted to work. That was the kind of person I wanted to work for." He paused. "I know that's a strange thing to admit." She felt something moving in her chest like water through newly opened ground. "It's not a strange thing," she said quietly. "And then I got here and I met you," he continued, and his voice had gone lower and more careful, the way he spoke when something mattered to him very much. "And everything Cutter said was true, and also none of it captured what you actually are. Because you're not tough in the way a rock is tough. You're tough in the way a living tree is tough. You can be pushed and bent, and you don't break because you're alive all the way through." He looked at his hands on the table. "I've been trying to find the right time to say that, and I don't think there is a right time. I think there's just this time." Florence looked at him for a long moment. The April light was warm on the table between them, and outside, a meadowlark was singing in the high grass, that clear, liquid, extravagant song that never failed to seem too beautiful for a landscape this hard. And she thought about all the ways she had learned to be alone, and how some of them had served her, and some of them had become habits she had confused with preferences. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while, in the good April morning, and neither of them needed to say anything else immediately. The spring and early summer that followed were the best months Florence could remember on the homestead, and she was honest with herself about the reason for that, even while she kept it in careful proportion. They were still working hard, in fact, because spring planting demanded everything, and the cattle needed rotating through new pastures, and the windmill needed a thorough maintenance before summer, and the fence line needed inspection after the winter. But the work was different now. There was a quality to it, to the evenings on the porch after supper, to the shared meals, to the small exchanges during a long day that had no purpose except connection, that she had not had before and had not known she was missing as specifically as she had apparently been missing it. He kissed her for the first time in May, standing next to the corrals in the evening, and it was not dramatic. It was quiet and careful, and when he pulled back, he looked at her with that clear gray-blue gaze and said, "I've wanted to do that since September," and she said, "I know," which was both honest and a little hilarious given how careful she had been. He laughed. She loved the way he laughed. They spent the early summer learning each other with the same attentiveness they brought to the land, carefully, specifically, without rushing, because neither of them was in the business of rushing things they valued. He told her about Missouri and his mother and the 5 children and the farm. She told him about Ohio, where she'd grown up, and the family she'd come from, and why she had said yes to Walter Chandler's proposal, and followed him out to Nebraska when she was 22 years old with no very clear idea of what that meant. "Did you love him?" Tobias asked one evening. Not challenging, just asking, because they had reached the kind of easy honesty where such questions were possible. "I loved who I thought he was," she said, "and who he actually was a different person, not a bad person, but not the one I had imagined. We made a reasonable life together, and I was genuinely sad when he died, and that's the most honest thing I can say about it." "That's honest enough," he said. "What about you? Was there anyone?" "Once, in Texas. She didn't want the life I was living. She was right not to want it." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I needed to find the right life before I could find the right person. I wasn't ready before. And now," he looked at her across the porch in the summer dusk, "now," he said, "I'm exactly where I want to be." The Greer situation came to its head in July. Florence had been expecting it, had been watching for it, because men like Greer do not give up, they escalate, and then they overreach. And the overreach is where they become vulnerable. What he did was send a man to file a fraudulent claim with the county land office, asserting that Florence's original homestead deed was improperly filed, and that a portion of her eastern pasture, the part nearest the creek, was not legally hers. It was a lie built from paperwork, and the assumption that a widow woman would not have the resources or the knowledge to fight it effectively. He was wrong. Florence drove to the county seat herself with her original deed and every piece of documentation she had filed over 7 years, and Tobias rode with her because she did not ask him not to, and because he had taken it as a personal commitment to see Greer's overreach answered. She also had, in her bag, copies of the journal entries she had been keeping, and she had written ahead to Tobias's contact in the land office. The hearing at the county land office lasted 2 days. The land office official who presided over it, a thin, careful man named Aldous Pierce, read every document she presented. He heard testimony from the neighbor Cutter and from 2 other homesteaders who had faced similar tactics from Greer's operation. He received the letter from the territorial office noting the pattern of complaints. On the second afternoon, Aldous Pierce dismissed Greer's claim entirely. He also noted in the written record, for the first time officially, that Mr. Greer's pattern of activity regarding neighboring property holders warranted further review. It was not, Florence knew, the complete end of it. Men like Greer did not stop because of one official setback, but it was something. It was real, documented, official something, and she walked out of that building into the bright July sun feeling lighter than she had in 2 years. Tobias was waiting on the courthouse steps. He had been asked to wait outside during the final deliberation, which was a formality she had not objected to. He stood up when she came through the door and read her face, and his expression opened into something she'd seen only a few times: unguarded relief. "We won," she said. He came down the steps to her and took her hands, and she thought he might swing her around right there on the courthouse steps of the county seat like something out of a dime novel. But he didn't. He just held both her hands and looked at her with those steady eyes and said, "Of course you did. This was never a question. You knew I'd win. I knew you wouldn't stop until you did, which is different from knowing it was certain but leads to the same place." She squeezed his hands. Around them, the July day was brilliant and hot, and the town went about its business around their small moment of triumph, and she thought that this was what it felt like to have someone who was entirely on your side. Harlan Greer sent no more men to her gate. She heard through the Caldwell Crossing Information Network, which functioned primarily through the saloon and Emmett's store, that Pierce's note about further review had made Greer's lawyer nervous, and that Greer had shifted his attention to easier targets elsewhere. Florence suspected he would trouble someone else in time, and she intended to document that if it came to her knowledge, but the immediate threat to her land was over. She sat on her porch one evening in late July and looked out at her homestead, the wheat fields coming toward harvest golden in the evening light, the cattle fat on good summer grass, the windmill turning in the warm breeze, the barn solid and the house sound, and she felt the particular deep satisfaction of having held something against everything that had tried to take it. Tobias came out and sat beside her. He had brought coffee, which he did every evening. "I've been thinking," she said. About what comes next." He was quiet, the way he was quiet when he was really listening. "I've been planning this place alone for 7 years," she said. "Every decision, every plan, every worry. Alone. And I thought I preferred it that way because I never had a partner who was actually a partner. But this last year," she stopped and looked at him. "I don't want to plan alone anymore. I don't want to do this alone anymore." Tobias set his coffee down on the porch rail. He looked at her with an expression that was the most serious she had seen on him, and also the most tender, and these two things together were exactly right. "Florence Chandler," he said, "are you asking me something?" "I'm telling you something," she said, "and then I'm asking." "All right. I'm telling you that I love you. I've known it since February, but I'm saying it now." She held his gaze. "And I'm asking if you would be willing to stay here, not as my employee, as my husband, as my partner in this place and in all the plans I intend to make for it." She paused. "I'm asking because I want to, not because I need saving. I've demonstrated fairly thoroughly that I don't need saving." He was quiet for a full moment, and she watched his face move through something, through the seriousness and the tenderness and something that might have been simple joy, uncomplicated and complete. "You've demonstrated it extremely thoroughly," he said. "On multiple occasions. With a rifle and a lawyer and a pickaxe and a journal that a circuit court judge would be impressed by." He reached over and took her hand. "Florence, I love you. I have loved you since some time in October when you sat in an empty smokehouse looking at empty hooks, and I watched something in your face move through loss and land on anger and then land on what to do next. And I thought, this is the most remarkable person I have ever known." She felt her throat tighten in a way that was not unpleasant. "That's when you decided you loved me, when I was furious about stolen meat." "That's when I knew I already did," he said. "I think the beginning was earlier." She laughed and he laughed, and she leaned over and kissed him there on the porch in the July evening with the wheat going gold in the last light, and it was not careful or tentative this time but full and certain, the way you kiss someone when the decision has been made and you are both moving in the same direction. "Is that a yes?" she said against his mouth. "It's an emphatic yes," he said. They were married in September, in the small white church in Caldwell Crossing, on a day that was exactly what September in the Sandhills can be when it decides to cooperate clear and warm, and with that particular quality of light that happens when the summer intensity has softened, but the full austerity of autumn hasn't arrived yet. It was a light that made everything look deliberate and clean. Florence wore a dress she had made herself over the course of 3 weeks, blue-gray wool that matched the color she associated with him, and that she thought suited the season and the place. She carried wildflowers she had picked that morning from the edge of the eastern pasture. She did not have family there. Her Ohio family was too far and too scattered, but she had neighbors. Emmett Frawley came, and his wife. The farmer Cutter came with his wife and 3 children. Several other homesteaders from the area came, people she had known as acquaintances and who had become something warmer through the shared experiences of living in a place that tested you consistently. Tobias had no family close either. His siblings were scattered through Missouri and Kansas, and he had not had time to reach them, but he had written to all of them. He stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that Emmett had helped him locate through his supply network, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle in a way that she felt from across the whole length of the small building, full and certain, the same direction. The minister's name was Reverend Hayes, a thin, energetic man who had been conducting services in Caldwell Crossing for 10 years, and who had buried people and christened people and married people on this frontier, and who had a specific understanding of what marriages out here meant, that they were made between people who had chosen each other with open eyes and clear knowledge of what the life required. He made the ceremony short and plain and real. The vows were the traditional ones, but Florence heard them differently than she had heard them at 22. Not as a script, but as a specific set of promises she understood the full weight of and was choosing freely. When Reverend Hayes said the words were spoken, and Tobias kissed her in front of the congregation, Emmett's wife made a sound that was half laugh and half something else, and Cutter clapped his hands once and then the rest of them joined in, and the sound filled the small church and went up into the clear September air. They drove home in the wagon in the afternoon light, just the 2 of them, with the prairie opening in every direction and the house visible from a mile away, sitting solid and square on the land. "How does it feel?" he asked her. She considered the question honestly. "Like something I chose," she said. "Like something I earned." He smiled. "Same. Also," she said, "it feels right, exactly right." "Same," he said again, and took the reins in one hand and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him as the horse walked them home. The first year of their marriage was full in every sense of the word. The wheat harvest that fall was the best Florence had had in 3 years, good enough that she paid off the credit at Emmett's completely, and had enough left to put money toward the new fencing she needed on the southern pasture, and to purchase 4 more young cattle to build the herd toward 40 head. She and Tobias planned together, argued sometimes about priorities in the direct and not unkind way of people who respect each other's opinions, and generally landed in the right place. He applied his name to the homestead deed alongside hers, which was the legal formality that completed the practical reality they were already living. She had thought she might feel something complicated about this, the surrender of a solo ownership she had maintained through so much effort, but she felt instead an uncomplicated satisfaction, because the deed with 2 names on it represented something truer than the deed with 1 name had. They found their rhythms and adjusted to them. His tendency to rise before her in the morning and have the stove going by the time she came down, her tendency to stay up later reading while he slept, the way they moved through the kitchen and the barn and the yard without collision or negotiation, because they had learned each other's movements. There were mornings that felt so entirely like what a life should be that she caught herself standing in the middle of her kitchen with a coffee cup in her hand and a feeling of something she could only call gratitude, not the performative kind but the real kind, the kind that lives deep and quiet. They had disagreements. He thought she worked herself past reasonable limits and told her so, which she occasionally resented and more often acknowledged was fair. She thought he was slower than necessary to ask for help when they needed it and told him so with equal directness, and he acknowledged the same. These disagreements did not damage them. They were the necessary friction of 2 strong people building something shared, and they were always followed by the kind of resolution that happens between people who are genuinely committed to each other's well-being. In the spring of their second year, Florence knew she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 3 weeks before she was certain, and she sat with the knowledge privately for 3 more days, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be sure before she said the words that would change everything again. She was 31 years old and healthy and had no specific reason for fear, but she had lived enough to know that the frontier did not always honor reasonable expectation. She told him on a Tuesday morning in April, the same month when everything in their story seemed to choose to change. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and she sat across from him and said, "I have something to tell you," and then told him. Tobias Redmond put his coffee down and looked at her for a long moment, and she could see everything crossing his face: surprise, and then something so far beyond surprise that it had its own quality, a particular light. "Are you sure?" he said very quietly. "I'm sure." He got up from the table and came around to her and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she turned her face into his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while in the April kitchen with the stove warm and the meadowlark going outside and the light coming in gold. "Are you scared?" he asked against her hair. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "A little," he said. "And also, I know," she said. "Me too." Because the other thing, the joy of it, the profound and specific joy, did not require a word for him to communicate it. She felt it in the way he held her, and she felt it in herself, and they both understood that this was the next thing, the good next thing, after everything that had come before. She had the baby in December. She labored with Emmett's wife, Clara, acting as midwife, a capable, experienced woman who had brought many frontier babies into the world, in the bedroom of the house on the homestead, in the deep winter cold with the stove going hard and Tobias in the next room, because Clara said men in the room made labor harder, and neither Tobias nor Florence argued with Clara about anything medical. It was hard work in the way that all the hardest work of her life had been hard, fully consuming, demanding everything, allowing no distraction from what needed to be done. And then it was done, and Clara was saying, "You have a boy, Florence, a good strong boy," and Florence heard a sound that reorganized everything she thought she knew about the full extent of human feeling. Clara brought the baby to her, and she held him for the first time and looked at his face, red and creased and furious about the cold world he'd arrived in, and thought that she had held on to this land through drought and flood and thieves for this, among other things, for a future, for the specific shape of this moment. Tobias came in shortly after when Clara went to fetch water, and he stood in the bedroom doorway looking at her, and at the baby with an expression that was past any expression she had seen on him before, entirely undone and entirely happy, which was a combination she did not know a face could hold until she saw his holding it. She said, "Come and meet your son." He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched his face do something she would remember with absolute clarity for the rest of her life. "Hello," Tobias said to the baby, very softly, as if he were addressing someone enormously important. "Hello." "I'm your father," the baby made a sound. Florence laughed quietly. "He's not impressed," Tobias said. "He will be," she said. "Give him time." They named him James Walter Redmond, James for Tobias's father, Walter as a gesture toward the history of the land he was born on. The naming felt right and complete. The winter passed with the particular quality that winters with a baby in the house have, difficult and illuminating in equal measure, requiring the same endurance and adaptation that the land itself required, and punctuated by the kind of moments that make a life feel very full and very specific. James was healthy and decisive in his opinions, which they both agreed was not a surprise given whose child he was, and by spring, he was making noises at the meadowlark through the kitchen window that seemed to be genuine conversation on his part. The homestead continued to grow and improve. In their third year together, Tobias had an idea for expanding the cattle operation. Not dramatically, not in the way that would strain their resources, but strategically, building towards 60 head by the end of the decade, which was the kind of operation that could reliably support a family and weather bad years without crisis. Florence ran the numbers and agreed, and they began to implement it together. She also expanded the kitchen garden significantly that year, partly because they needed more produce with a growing child and partly because she had discovered that gardening, which she had always done out of necessity, gave her something she recognized as pleasure when she had enough time to do it properly. She grew tomatoes and beans and squash and the particular variety of apple mint that had been her mother's in Ohio, and that she had somehow kept going for 8 years through every difficulty the frontier had offered. The Land Office review of Harlan Greer's activities concluded 2 years after the original complaint was filed, and resulted in a formal censure and a substantial fine for improper interference with homestead rights. Florence heard about it in a letter from Aldous Pierce, who had apparently found her case as important as she had. She read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and felt satisfied in the deep, clean way of justice actually done. "It's over," she said to Tobias, who was across the table helping James, now almost 2 and deeply interested in everything not destroy a biscuit. "Greer. Formal censure and a fine, and a note in the record." She tapped the letter. "It's real." He looked at her across the table with James between them making incomprehensible but confident pronouncements about the biscuit. "It was always going to be real," he said. "You made sure of that." "We made sure of it," he smiled. "We did." She folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept her important documents, and thought that the drawer now held the full history of what she had built here. The original deed, the flood damage record, the drought logs, the sheriff letters, the land office correspondence, the marriage certificate, James's birth record, and all of it together was the story of this place and the people who had held it. The years went on the way good years do, full and quick and marked by seasons and work, and the small and large events that make a life. They had a second child 4 years after James, a daughter they named Clara Elizabeth after the midwife who had delivered her brother, and after Florence's grandmother in Ohio. Clara was born in the spring, which seemed right for a child who came out with her eyes open and immediately curious about the world, and who showed from her first weeks an interest in the outdoors that had James, by then a sturdy 4-year-old, constantly trying to keep up with her determination to investigate everything. James was already following his father around the pasture by the time he was 3, learning the names of the cattle and how to move quietly around them, and Tobias taught him with the same patience and specificity he brought to everything. Florence sometimes watched them from the kitchen window, the tall man and the small boy, moving through the morning together with matching attentiveness to the world, and felt such a specific and quiet happiness that she sometimes had to put down what she was doing and simply stand in it for a moment. Clara was a different temperament, fiercer, faster, more immediately decisive, less interested in the gradual accumulation of knowledge and more interested in direct experiment. She would be either a rancher or a lawyer or possibly both, Florence thought, watching her daughter conduct negotiations with the chickens at age 3 with absolute authority. Their 10th year on the homestead together, the decade marker that Florence had not let herself think about when she was 29 years old facing 4 men at her gate, arrived on a spring morning that was clear and generous, with the new grass coming up green and the creek running full after a good wet spring, and the cattle fat on the fresh pasture. James was 9 now and Clara 5, and both of them were at school in Caldwell, crossing 3 days a week since the town had established a proper 1-room schoolhouse with a qualified teacher. Florence was 39. Tobias was 43. They both showed the years in the way people who work outdoors show years, weathered, capable, comfortable in their bodies. She had a few silver threads in her auburn hair. He had more gray than brown now and wore it without concern. On that spring morning, Florence walked the full perimeter of her land, their land, though she still sometimes thought of it in the possessive singularity of the woman who had held it alone. And she walked it deliberately, the way she had walked it when she first arrived as a young wife, and then as a widow who refused to leave, and then as a woman who had kept it through drought and flood and thieves, and every pressure a man like Harlan Greer could bring to bear. She walked the northern line where they had rebuilt fence posts in the snow. She walked past the east pasture where the creek ran clear and full. She walked past the storage pond that she and Tobias had dug in 2 brutal July days, which had held water every summer since and had saved the herd more than once. She walked past the barn and the smokehouse with its good new lock and the kitchen garden where the apple mint was already coming up again for another year. She came back to the house where Tobias was on the porch with coffee. He handed her a cup when she came up the steps. "Inventory complete?" he asked. "All present," she said. He looked out at the morning. "It's a good piece of land." "It's a great piece of land," she said. "I always knew that. You fought for it like you did." She sat down in the second porch chair, the one he had made for her the winter after James was born, because she needed somewhere comfortable to sit while she nursed, a fact she had pointed out and he had immediately addressed with characteristic practicality, and looked out at the prairie in the morning light. "Do you know what Cutter said about me?" she asked. "Before you came here. He said you were the toughest thing on the frontier," Tobias said. "He said it like it was the finest thing he could imagine. And that's why you came. That's why I found the road that went past your gate," he said. "It's not why I stayed." She looked at him. "Why did you stay?" He smiled, that unguarded, full smile that she had been seeing for 8 years and that still did to her chest exactly what it had always done. "Because you were everything he said and also everything he couldn't have said. Because the land needed tending and so did you, though you'd have shot me for saying that at the time." "I might have," she agreed. "And because by the time I knew I was staying I couldn't have imagined anywhere else." She put her hand on his arm. He put his hand over hers. They sat together in the spring morning the way they had learned to sit together in all mornings, comfortably, fully, without the need to fill the silence with anything other than what was already there. Across the yard, the windmill turned in the breeze. The wheat fields beyond showed the New Year's green beginning. In the house behind them, Clara's voice carried out through the open window. She had gotten up and was telling someone, probably James, something definitive about something she considered important, in the way she always spoke, which was entirely her mother's. James's lower, more patient voice answered her in the way he always answered, which was entirely his father's. Florence listened to her children through the morning air and looked at her land and felt the full weight and gift of everything she had held onto and everything that had come from holding on, and thought that it was very good, that all of it, every difficult season and every hard-won year, had been worth every piece of what it had cost. "Tobias," she said, "do you remember the first morning you came here, for the interview? You said the work was important work and you'd be proud to be part of it." "I remember. Were you?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was really thinking about something, not performing the thinking but actually doing it. "Florence," he said, "being part of this is the best thing I've ever done with my life." She squeezed his arm. He turned and kissed her temple simply, quietly, the way married people who love each other do ordinary things after long enough together that the ordinary is the miracle. Clara's voice inside had reached some kind of conclusion about whatever she had been arguing, and James made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been strategic silence. The meadowlark started up from the east pasture, that clear and improbable song, and it came across the yard in the morning air, and the windmill turned, and the spring light moved across the land that Florence Chandler had kept through drought and flood and the designs of smaller men than herself, through loneliness and endurance and the particular steel that forms in a person who decides, every single morning, that what they have built is worth fighting for. She had been the toughest thing on the frontier. She still was. And now she was also this, seated on her porch in the spring morning, coffee warm in her hands, her husband beside her, her children inside the house they all shared, the land green and the creek running and the future spreading out before her as wide as the Nebraska sky. She thought that was exactly right. She thought that was everything. Later that afternoon, when the children were home from the neighbors where they'd gone to play, and the evening chores were done, and supper was on the stove filling the house with the smell of good food and wood smoke, Florence sat at the kitchen table with her journal, not the record of grievances she'd kept against Greer, which was filed and finished, but the other journal, the one she'd started the year James was born, which held the record of a different kind of accumulation. She turned to a fresh page and wrote the date. Then she sat for a moment, listening to the house Tobias's voice in the next room talking to James about something to do with the cattle, Clara's footsteps running across the floor the way she always ran, quick and certain she was going somewhere worth going. Florence wrote, "Another good day. Spring is fully here. The creek is running well. The south pasture looks strong. James asked his father today how you know when you love something enough to fight for it, and Tobias said you know because it doesn't feel like fighting. It feels like breathing." She looked at what she'd written and thought it was true in every direction. Then she closed the journal and went to stir the stew and call her family to supper. And the lamp came on against the evening dark, and the house held them all close and warm. And outside the prairie went on under the stars in its vast and gorgeous indifference. And against all of it, or rather because of all of it, this small particular life shone.